All right, so I guess we can just dive into it. I'm going to start off today kind of reviewing a few of the steps that we covered yesterday because I know that it was pretty fast. I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So just to get everyone oriented, uh, essentially what we'll be building out today, again, is like this live chat feature where you don't have to refresh the page in order to see DMs. And just to kind of recap what we built yesterday, we built out this new page called Chatbook, which divides into a few child components. Specifically, we built out this chat and single message and new message components in workshop 8. And that's kind of what we saw at the end of that workshop. And today we'll be building out some other features like this chat list and the single user. So again, just to like kind of navigate through where all these things lie on the page, this chat feature is this right half that we built out in workshop 8. And in order to allow DMs, we're going to be building out this chat list that's composed of like individual single user objects. In workshop 8, we also built out a few API endpoints, specifically the get endpoint at /chat, which clients can use to obtain new messages to display on the server or on their client, and a post message endpoint where clients can send new messages to the server, where it will be saved in the database and other clients will be able to retrieve it. All right, so just to kind of review like what we walked through yesterday, could everyone follow these steps to get started with workshop 9? I'll actually do the same thing in my terminal as well. So git fetch, git reset card, git checkout, w9 slash or dash starter. Don't forget to pull because we did make some changes. And then finally npm install. I guess when everyone's like at this step with me, could I just get a quick thumbs up? Sweet. Okay, so, oh, and I just wanted to also mention that like we put together some quick documentation on some of the socket functions that we provided for you. So these can be found at weblab.is/socket-guide and also socket-docs. So if you're ever confused about like any of the functions we're going over, check those out, or feel free to also just ask out loud. So if you'll recall from the lecture yesterday, we kind of have a two-step process for the basic utilization of a socket. And the first step in that process is to broadcast a message from the server to all the connected sockets. Again, this uses this socket manager package that we've already kind of implemented for you that provides basic wrapper functions around the socket.io library. And in order to emit a message to everyone connected to the server, we're going to use this following syntax. So we're going to say socket manager.getIO, which will get all connected sockets. And then we're going to use .emit to emit an event. And the event name can be specified to any string we desire. And we can also package some data alongside that event emission as well. The second step in kind of utilizing sockets would be to actually tell the client to listen for this message. So on the client's code, this can be done with socket.on. And again, we'll specify the event name that we're listening for. And these should be the same thing, just to make sure that like we're listening for the correct event. And we'll also pass in a callback function that will be executed whenever the client hears that event. So we're going to go ahead and implement this on our chat book in order to see chat messages live. And again, we said this was a two-step process. So we're first going to start with broadcasting this message on the back end. So if everyone could navigate to app.js, or sorry, api.js, and navigate to the /message endpoint that we implemented in workshop 8. This should be line 85. We can see that like this is where we receive a message from the client, kind of create a message database object, and then save it to the database. So the thing we want to add here is to actually emit that socket event that clients will listen for. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be using this syntax displayed on the board with this get IO and emit. So this will be socket manager dot get IO dot emit. And again, we get to kind of name this event anything we want. Because it's representing a new message, we're just going to call this message for now. And finally, we're going to pass some data along with this event to the client. And this will be the message object that we just created. So now whenever a client will call this /message endpoint to send a new message, the server will emit this event and notify all the clients that it's received a new message. The next step is to, again, have the client listen for this message. So in order to do this, we can navigate to chatbook.js. And if you'll scroll to line 67, you'll see we have an empty use effect where we'll actually add this socket. So to this, we'll use this socket.on. And we'll need to specify the event that we're listening for. So again, we called this message. So we'll say message here. And then we'll need to specify what we want to do with the data that's passed alongside that socket emission. And we've actually, again, already implemented this function up here for you called add messages. What this does is it simply takes the new message. In this case, we call it data. And it will concatenate this new message to the end of our previous message list. So we'll simply call that as the callback function in our socket. And now the client knows that it should use this function whenever it hears this message event. So finally, again, we have to add this cleanup function whenever you use sockets. And again, I'll just type this out real quick and then explain what's happening in a bit. So it'll look like this, socket.off, and we'll pass in the same parameters we used for the socket.on call. So remember that whenever we have a use effect, we can perform what's called a cleanup by returning a function in the return statement. And what this will do is it will execute the code in the function whenever the component that it's contained in dismounts. So in this example, whenever this chatbook page dismounts, for example, this could be navigating away from the page or closing the browser, the socket that we've turned on initially will be turned off to avoid adding a bunch of like lag to our server. So to just kind of go through like how this will work again one more time, if you recall, like what we want is we want clients to be able to immediately know when a new message has been sent. So let's say Fluffy wants to send you a message. Fluffy will still use that post API message endpoint that we implemented in workshop 8. However, because we added the socket mission, the server will be able to use that socket to immediately notify all clients that a new message has been received, as well as pass that new message along to them for them to display on their browsers. And just to like be sure we can demo this, so if we navigate to, let me start my server. So npm start. and then npm run hot loader. And then if we navigate to our local host 5050, login, we should be able to see that if we type a new message, we can immediately see it without having to refresh the page. And also, again, this should work with multiple users. So if you open up another Google account and log in, I should be able to send a message from this account and see it on the other without typing anything or refreshing the page, sorry. Cool. So is everyone able to see new messages without refreshing the page? And I'll scroll back to the code if anyone's still looking. Could I just get like a thumbs up if we're all good? Nice. Okay. So that's essentially like, for most socket use cases, like all we need. We simply need to broadcast something from the server using this get io.emit syntax. And then we need to listen for that same event on the client. In the next few steps, we'll be talking about what we want to do if we need to broadcast events like to specific clients. And if you recall, like Andrew yesterday mentioned this problem of like the server doesn't actually know which client is connected to which socket. Like, and the reason for this is just because like the client's actually the one that holds all of the socket information in terms of like the ID and such. So what we need to implement is like a way for the server to identify a client and understand that it has a socket that belongs to it. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have a new endpoint at /API/init sockets. And what that endpoint is going to do is it's going to allow the client to say, hey, I'm like Whiskers, for example, and this is the socket that I'm connected to. And the server will remember that mapping so that whenever we need to identify who Whiskers is, we can just look that up and immediately know that Whiskers socket is socket 1, for example. So we're going to work through that in step 1. So in order to get caught up, could everyone git reset --hard? And then git checkout W9 step 1. So the first thing we're going to do is create this init socket endpoint that the client will be able to use in order to tell the server which socket they're connected to. And as with all of our other API endpoints, we'll kind of implement this in api.js. So if we can all navigate to that file. And then navigate to line 76, we see that there's kind of this empty init socket endpoint that we'll need to fill out. So what we're going to do is we're first going to check if the user is logged in, because if the user isn't logged in, there's not really any person that we can associate the socket with. So we're going to say if rec.user, and what this will happen is like, if this field is not null, this code will execute. Otherwise, nothing will happen. And we're going to use that socket manager package that we've implemented for you in order to kind of register this user and associate with its socket. So it's going to look like socket manager dot add user. And the first argument will be simply the user that's calling this endpoint, so rec.user. And the second argument will be the socket that the user is currently connected to. And we can get this with another function that we provided for you, and that's at socket manager dot get socket from socket ID. And it will accept the socket ID that's passed to this endpoint by the user. So this will be rec.body.socket ID. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll get into that in a bit. When we call this API endpoint, we'll need to pass in like this socket ID as part of the body of the request. So that will be like in the next step. Yeah. Yeah, so add user is a function that we've written for you that essentially tells the server to remember that this user is associated with the socket we get back from this. The reason we need to do that is because like, if we don't do that, the server won't know that the user that's calling this endpoint like owns this socket. They'll just be like anonymous sockets. Yeah, so if you recall, like when we make post requests to post endpoints, we can pass in some data in the body of the request. And we'll see how we can do that in a bit when we actually call this function from the client. And just to kind of like answer the second part of your question, like this is essentially a function that we've written for you that takes like the socket ID we pass in and gets the socket that is associated with that socket ID so that we can kind of say that this socket belongs to this user. Okay, so now that we've implemented this endpoint, the next step is to have the client call this endpoint so that we can register all of them and know which sockets belong to who. And to do that, we're going to navigate to app.js. And you can see some code here that like handles the login that we talked about yesterday. And what we want to do is like after the user logs in, we'll want to call this init socket endpoint and establish that like, okay, I'm logged in now. I'm going to tell you that this socket belongs to me. So we're going to make this post request to /API/init socket. And here's where we can pass in like that information that belongs to the rec.body here. We'll pass in an object with a field called socket ID. And the value of that will be socket.id, where this is essentially like the ID that the socket or the client is using. It's essentially just like a random string that's generated whenever the client connects with a new socket. So now whenever any user logs into our website, they'll make this post request to this init socket endpoint we've implemented, which will tell the server to remember that like this user is associated with this socket. And we'll see in the next few steps how we can actually use that to our advantage to implement DMs. But that's all for step one. We've essentially implemented this endpoint, have the client call it, and now the server is able to associate particular users with individual sockets. So are there any questions here? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Sorry, could you repeat the last part? Yeah, so I don't know if I can easily access, let's see. So you can imagine kind of like this, where like each of these socket connections is like one of these like communication lines. And like all of these clients will open a different socket connection with the server. And what we want to be able to do when doing this is like, we want to associate like this top client with this particular socket so that if we only wanted to emit something to one of the clients, we know which socket to use. Yeah. Is this big enough for everyone, the code? Cool. Okay, so our next step will just be to build out some of like the components that we'll be using to implement DMs. So if we could all like just get on the same page by typing git reset dash dash hard, and then checking out W9 dash step 2. Oops. And don't forget to git pull on this step because we made some changes to the Mongo server as well. Okay, so our first step in this step will be to like implement the components that represent these individual names that we should be able to click on to change our chat. So this will be done in single user.js. And you can see there's like some skeleton CSS here, which isn't the most important thing in the world, just some styling to make it look as shown on the slides. The key part here is like this on-click button. And what we want to happen when we click on one of these users is we want to change like the chat that's shown on the right. And the way we're going to do that, if we look at like our skeleton component tree, is we're going to represent the active user in this variable called active chat. Because the active chat is a state in like this parent component chatbook, if we want to be able to change it from a child component like single user, we'll need to pass down a callback function like this set active user, a callback function. And if we look at our code, we'll want to call this function when this component is clicked. So within this onClick like callback function, we'll want to access the callback function that we passed down from our chat book to our chat list and then to our single user. So this will be in props.set active user. And the user we want to set is the user that this single user represents. Yeah. Great. So we'll see this in the next few steps. But essentially the question was like, what do these represent? So active chat will represent the chat that we're displaying in this right window. So this consists of like an array of message objects, which we built out in workshop 8, and also consists of the recipient, which is the user we're currently chatting with. In the next few steps, you'll see how we can implement the set active user callback function to change the recipient of this chat data. This active users array will also implement in the next few steps. We'll essentially store a list of all users that are currently connected to the website. And we'll use that to be able to know like who to display in this list. But just to finish out this coding real quick, as I mentioned, like when we click on this single user component, we'll want to set the active user to the user that this single user represents. And that can be found this like user prop that we pass down. And kind of as we build out like the parents of this component, you'll see kind of how all this information flows down. One last thing is we'll also need to actually like display something for the user to see when they look these buttons. So that will just be like the name of the user that this single user represents. Yeah. Yeah, so like if you look at this file, set active user is not actually defined anywhere. So like the reason for that is because if we look at like our component tree, like the variable that we want to be changing is in this parent component chatbook. So like if we wanted to change something in a parent component, we have to define the function in the same component so that we can use like that set state React syntax. Does that make sense? Or if not, it's okay. But like, just let me know. Yes, that's a good question. So the question was like, when we are referencing props, aren't we referencing like this chat list? And that's true. But like, if you see the way that we chose to pass down these props, like we pass down the set active user from chatbook to chat list, and we pass that same function down from chat list to single user. So at the end of the day, like, yeah, it's the same exact function. So at the end of the day, when we call it from single user, it's actually the same thing we passed down from chatbook, just through like this chat list component. Yeah. Yes. So what we want to do when we like change the active user is we want to change the chat that's displayed on the right hand window. So this information is actually stored in active chat as a recipient down here. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to be changing this recipient um, in this set active user function. The active users array is like something slightly different. In the next few workshops, we'll see like how we get that, but essentially it's just going to represent all the users that are currently on the website. So our next step is to like use this single user component we just built in order to populate this chat list. So if we go to chatlist.js, what we're going to want to do is like create a single user component or button for every single user that's passed down into this chat list. So in order to do this, we're going to use like this common React syntax we've seen when we want to like populate an array of components. And it's going to look something like props dot users dot map. So remember that this dot map function takes like an array and applies like some callback function on every element in the array. What this users array is it's essentially like the array of active users. And we're going to want to display a single user for every single one of them. So we're going to essentially map all of these users to a single user component. And just so everyone's on the same page, like the single user takes in a few different props shown here. So we'll just need to pass all these props down into each of these single user components that we are building. And these props are set active user, which again, we're actually obtaining from like a prop itself as well. It's going to take in the user that this single user represents. And it's also going to take in a Boolean that represents whether or not this is the current active chat. So again, essentially what's happening here is we have a list of users that we want to display in this chat list component. And we're going to use this dot map syntax to do that. And we're going to map every single one of these user objects to a single user components. I actually forgot one thing here. Oh, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So this is like a kind of React specific thing where like if we are rendering multiple components of the same type on a single page, React expects them to have a unique identifier as the key. So that's kind of like why we pass this index in to give each of these components a unique index. It doesn't, it's not strictly necessary to do this, but if you don't include this and you look at your console, you'll see that React gives you a bunch of warnings. It's essentially because like React uses this key to like optimize rendering, and when it's missing, it like doesn't like it. Okay, cool. So that was like essentially implementing those two components. The next step for us is to actually add the chat list component to our chatbook page. And to kind of get started on this, let's just check out step 3. So we're on the same page. So git reset dash dash hard, git checkout w9 dash step 3. And again, just because we made some changes, we can pull here to make sure we're all up to date. So I guess I'll actually give everyone like a chance to try this themselves. What we want to do again is to add this chat list that we just built out to the main chatbook page. So this can be done in chatbook.js. And on line 86, you'll see where the change should be made. I guess one thing I should mention is like that. Sorry, let me find it. Yes, there's right now a dummy set active user, right, that we'll implement in the next few steps. But for now, you can just kind of use this to pass in as that prop. All right, how are people feeling? Do you think we need more time, or are we ready to go ahead and walk through this? All right, it looks like people are finishing up, so let's just go ahead and walk through this. So what we want to do is, again, add this chat list component to our chatbook page. And to do that, we're going to add it to this div right here. So first, let's just add this chat lists tag to our JSX. And what we'll need to do is fill out the individual props that should be passed to this chat list component. So if we look at kind of what props our chat list is expecting, we'll see that it expects 4 props. The first one is the users to display. So we can go ahead and fill that out. So remember that this active user state will eventually be populated. We'll do that in a future step, but it will represent all of the users that are connected to the website currently. It will also take in this active prop, which represents the current active user that you're chatting with. And we can obtain this from the active chat state. The recipient of the active chat is who we're currently chatting with. The next thing this chat list expects is the user ID of the client who's associated with this, or the user that's associated with this client. So this will be user ID. And this is actually passed down to us from the app component. So we can access this from the props. And finally, we'll pass in that set active user callback function we've been mentioning, which again, right now is just a dummy function, but we'll fill out in the next few steps. So are there any questions about kind of how we got any of these props or what we're doing here? Okay, cool. So if you navigate to like our local host right now, and we go to the chat page, you'll see that we don't actually see anyone here. And the reason for this is because we haven't actually populated like this active user state that represents everyone who is currently connected to the website. So that will be kind of the focus of our next step. And just to get on the same page again, let's go to our terminal. And let's git reset hard. And then check out W9 step 4. So in this step, we'll be building a new endpoint at /API/active users, which will tell the client all of the users who are currently connected to the website. And this can be done in api.js along with all of our other API endpoints at line 103. And I'll give everyone maybe just like a few minutes here. I don't think it's like the most interesting thing in the world, but go ahead and give it a try. And if you're not able to get it, don't worry, we'll walk through it after. I'll give it like 30 more seconds. Okay, so let's go ahead and just walk through this together. As the kind of first step mentions, what we want to do is send back an object with a field called active users. So let's just set up that skeleton real quick. So remember, to send something back to the user, we're going to use this res.send function. And we're going to want to build an object that has a field called active users. Remember that like this is supposed to return a list of all of the active users. And as the slides say, we can use this function that we've written for you, again, as part of the socket manager package called get all connected users. So what this function will do is it will return a list of all the users that the server has registered as having an active socket connection. And the reason why the server knows this in the first place is, again, because in step one and step two, or just step one, we implemented that init socket endpoint where the user would register its name with its socket. That's kind of how the server is able to tell who's still connected to the website. Are there any questions on this part, or kind of like what we're trying to do, or what any of these functions are accomplishing? Okay, cool. So as with all of our API endpoints, once we write the endpoint in api.js, the next step is to actually call that API endpoint somewhere in our client. So this will be step 5. So if you could all git reset -- hard, git checkout w9 - step 5. And what we'll be doing here again is just calling this endpoint we just implemented. So to do that, we'll navigate to chatbook.js. And navigate to line 69. And here what we'll do in this use effect is when the page loads, we'll want to call this endpoint to make sure, or to get a list of active users so that we can use it to populate our chat list here. So let's make a GET request to that endpoint we just created. Remember, like getting from or like making API requests is asynchronous. So this is actually a promise that we'll want to use this dot then syntax for. And once we get the data back from this endpoint, we want to populate this state that we've defined above called active users. So remember, to set state, we'll need to use the setter function associated with it. So let's say set active users. And if you remember, like the object that's returned by this endpoint we've written, so is like a object with a field called active users. So we'll want to access that field on the client side by saying data.active users. Now, the last thing to note here is that like, if you look at the way our chat page is set up, there's this option for all chat that's not actually technically the user, but we always want to have the option to chat with all chat. So we're just going to hard code that into our active users as well. So we'll say that not only do we want to have the array be like the active users, we also want to have the array start with all chat. So we first start with an array of just all chat, and we're going to concatenate all of the active users we just received from the server to that array as well. And remember, we want to do this because this active user state is what allows the chat list to know what they should display in this list. So now this is all finished. If we navigate to our localhost 5050, refresh, and then go to the chat page, we should see that we should be able to see our component here. Now there's like an interesting interaction here, which is that if you look at the way we defined our population of this state, this only happens once upon page loading. And if you notice what happened here is like, I don't actually see myself as part of this chat, even though I am a connected user. The reason for this is a bit subtle, but what's actually happening here is that the page load is occurring before the socket connection is established. So the server doesn't know that I'm connected yet. If you like navigate to a different page and go back, you'll see that I now show up because the socket has already had time to establish. So this kind of motivates like the next step of this workshop, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I just wanted to pause here for any questions. Does it kind of make sense to everyone why like if I refresh this page or if I log out and log back in? Okay. Well, I guess if I restart the server and break the socket connection, let me just demo it real quick. So let's say I restart my server and then I reload this page and log in. Like, does it make sense why I don't initially appear here? I guess like thumbs up if it makes sense. Okay, great. Okay, so in order to fix that, I guess like, does anyone have any ideas of like how we could potentially fix that? Using like a very similar solution to our live chat solution. How could we like notify the client that a new socket connection has been established without like refreshing the components or reloading the page? Yeah, exactly. So what we could do is set up another socket event that notifies all of the clients whenever like a new active user either joins or leaves the chat. So that's what we're going to be doing in step 6. So if we could all git reset -- hard and then check out step 6. And then again, here we can git pull. And I'll give everyone a chance to try to implement this themselves. On the server side, we've actually already implemented the broadcast to let everyone know that a new user has either joined or left. So all you have to do is make a change on the client side to listen for that event. So this event is called active users. and update the active users list accordingly whenever we catch that event on the client. And this change will be made in Chatbook, line 85. Yeah. Oh, yes. So we're listening specifically for an event called active users. Yeah. So like instead of this message, you would see like active users because of, yeah, that's like the name of the. So just again, what we want to be doing is adding a socket event very similar to the message socket event. And when we get a message or get that active users event, we're going to make a new API call to the active users to update the active users stored in chatbook.js in this state up here. is which function is it? So socket. Okay, so like, wait, is this on? Are you able to hear me in the back? Mid. All right, is it better now? All right, sweet. So the question was like, is socket.on asynchronous? Um, I guess the answer is like not really. Like immediately when you call socket.on, it will start listening on the client for the specific event that you specify here. However, like it's possible that the callback function you pass in has like some asynchronous elements. So I'll give it like one more minute and then we can walk through it together. Okay, so what we want to be doing again is adding a new socket listener on the client. And we can use a very similar like structure as the message listener that we created before. So we can just like, go ahead and get started with like this very basic structure. And we'll need to change a few things. The first is that we're going to be listening for a different event. So let's go ahead and specify the new event here. This event will be called active users. And we'll also be wanting to pass in a different callback function because we're doing a different task when this event is called. So I'm going to call this new callback function update active users. And I'm going to define that just right here. So what we're going to do here is we want to take in the data that we received alongside. There's an inconsistency here, but that's fine. This active users event also passes a list of all new active users. So we don't actually need to make any API calls here. What we simply need to do is take the data that is passed to the client alongside the socket event and update our active state list accordingly, kind of like what we did up here. So again, because active users is a state, we're going to be using the set function. And similarly to above, like we always want all chat to be displayed. So we're going to manually hard code that in first. And then we're going to concatenate all of the users that are currently connected, which we got from like the socket event to that list as well. So that's just to specify that like we're turning off a socket that listens for this event and also executes this callback function. Like I do believe that you could do this as well. This would turn off every socket that's listening to this though. So just to like avoid any like interleaving of like what we're trying to do, it's just easier or like more accepted practice to also pass in the callback function of like the one we're trying to turn off. So again, what this is doing is this will say, I'm going to start listening for an event called active users. Whenever I hear that event, I'm going to call this callback function, update active users. What the active users function is going to do is it's going to take all of the active users and add it to a list with all chat in the beginning and set that to be the active users. This active user state here is passed into our chat list component. You'll see here, allowing it to be rendered on the page. So if we now navigate to our local host 5050 and log in, we'll see that like we don't have the error we had before where we didn't show up initially. Furthermore, like if another user logs in, so if you open up a new tab and log in with a different account, we should be able to see like this active user list update automatically without us having to refresh the page. And similarly, when I log out, like it should automatically remove that user from the chat list. Is everyone able to see that? Oh, yes, some questions. So yeah, the question is, could we add this to, could we add like this one here? The answer is yes, but like just to make it more readable, it's nice to have like the different user effects separated out for different purposes. Gotcha. So that would definitely, are you saying like, could we turn on the socket in this use effect? It would do the same thing. We could do that. It would be functionally equivalent. It's just like nice to have like a use effect dedicated for like a socket. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I think the question was like why we didn't have to make new API requests. Was that okay? Yeah. So yeah, sorry, that was my bad. There was like some slight confusion on the slides, but like if we, so we've actually defined like this active users emission for you. And when we defined it, we said, oh, we're also going to pass alongside of it all of the active users. So we know as the like on the client side that we're going to be receiving all of the active users already. So we can just like use that directly rather than like making a new API request that would essentially give us the same information. Let me just see if I can like find that real quick to make it. Yes. So if you look here, like in service socket.js, it's not like super important to understand everything that's happening here. But like this emission that we've defined for you, it emits the active users event. And we can see that like with it, it passes this data called active users, which is already like all of the connected users. Alternatively, like we could make a new request every time we got that, like make a new request to /API/get active users every time you heard that socket event. It would just kind of like be redundant because we already have that data. Cool. But I guess is everyone able to like see the live updating users in the chat? I guess if not, just add yourself to the help queue and we'll move on to the next step. So if you'll notice, like when we like click on these buttons, nothing actually happens. And that's because like, if you'll recall, we're actually just using a dummy function that does a console log every time we click one of them. So you'll see that okay, like this console log occurs, but nothing else happens. And we want to actually happen is like to change the chat that's displayed here. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next step. So if we can all git reset dash hard and git checkout W9 step 7. And I think we'll actually just like walk through this one together because we're getting a little bit short on time. But if there's any confusion, like feel free to stop me. So what we're going to be doing is updating the set active user function in chatbook.js, line 96. And instead of a console log, we're actually going to want to change what's displayed in the chat. I guess I won't be able to see it right now because there's errors, but let's just fill that out. So the first thing I'm going to want to check is if I'm clicking on the user that's already active, I don't actually want to do anything because like that user is already active, so we don't need to set it to be active. So I'm going to do that with the statement right here. If the user that's like wants to be set active is already active, I'm just going to like return here and the rest of the function will not be executed. Otherwise, I'm going to continue with the function. And I'm going to use the set active chat setter, because again, active chat is a state. And remember that like the active chat is like this object with messages and recipient. So the recipient is going to be the new user that we're chatting with. And the messages we can kind of just initialize to be an empty array because we're going to do right after this is we're going to call load message history, which will kind of obtain all of the messages for the user that we care about. And you can see that that function is actually defined up above. So if we look at load message history, it simply makes an API call to the /chat endpoint with the new recipient. And it will set the chat messages accordingly. Just to kind of like walk through another way you'd structure this, one possible way we could do this is instead of like having this load message history here, we could instead add the active chat recipient as a dependency of this use effect here. So just kind of like walk through what that would look like. And instead of loading like all chat every time, we would want to load the chat of the current active user. So remember like when we add variables to this dependency array in a use effect, the use effect will execute every time this variable changes. So essentially what I've said here is like, anytime the recipient of the active chat changes, I'm going to call this function that will load the correct messages accordingly. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? Like both of those ways would be valid. It's kind of just like a matter of preference. So like if you'll go to our localhost now, you'll actually still see that when we click on different users, the chat doesn't change. And that's because like this endpoint we set up, this /API/chat endpoint is not yet set up to actually return messages that are not all chat. And we can see that if we like navigate to api.js, we'll see that at /chat, we always query for all chat. And that's what we're going to be kind of resolving in the next step. So I guess, does anyone have any questions about that so far? Okay, cool. So our next step would be to update this /chat endpoint, and we'll do that in step 8. So if you all navigate to api.js and look at line 83, what we want to do here is update this database query so that instead of returning messages for all chat every time we call it, we want to see like if it's a DM instead. And if it's a DM, we want to return those DMs instead of the all chat messages. This is like a kind of coding heavy part. So don't worry if you can't like follow along live. It's okay to just watch for the step. And we can like post more information about like what's exactly happening here. But essentially what we want to do is like first check to see if we're chatting with all chat. And if we are chatting with all chat, we're going to want to keep the query the same. And I'm actually going to just define the query outside of this function as well. And you'll see why in a bit, but essentially like we're going to want to conditionally set this query variable depending on whether this is an all chat or a DM. So if it's not all chat, then this is a DM. And we're going to want to look for messages that are sent from the user to the recipient or from the recipient to the user, kind of like that two-way communication. And we can do this by using this special syntax for database querying that looks something like this. So this first line is a query saying like, oh, I'm going to look for messages whose sender is me and the recipient is the recipient, so the person I'm chatting with. The other type of message we want to show is when it's reversed. When the sender is the person I'm chatting with, so this rect.query. And again, don't worry if you're like not able to follow this live. We'll like post these code solutions online. The second type of message you want to listen to is the opposite, when the person I'm chatting with is the sender and I'm the recipient. And what the syntax does is it says, I'm going to search my database and return queries that match this first query or this second query. And finally, now that like my query is set to handle DMs accordingly, I'm going to simply find it the same way, find all the messages the same way I did before, and then send those messages back to the client. So hopefully now, when we go to our localhost 5050 and we click on different users, we'll see that we can like correctly show or display the new chat. And if I like open up a new tab and start chatting with someone in a DM, so this is a DM. It should show up live on the other person's screen. And when I navigate away, it should go back to all chat. And when I navigate, that's awkward. All right, let's see what we got here. So when we post a message, gotcha. So this field is just incorrectly named here in this query. Okay, so hopefully this works. So if we again go back to our different tabs, log in, log in. All right. Okay, so we can see that like Okay, so let's say I'm like sending again, DM number 2. It shows up and it will persist that DM when I navigate back to the chats. Okay, so like essentially this is almost everything we need, and I am running out of time. I just wanted to demo one more thing, and I'll record a few of the last steps to view later. But one interesting thing to think about is like, let's say that one of the users is in all chats, but like another user is sending a DM to someone else. If you'll see that DM shows up in the all chats. And like, does anyone have an idea of why that might be? So again, I have one user that's sending a DM and I have another user that's in all chats. And when they send a DM, I can still see that DM in all chat. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So because our socket that we set up is just listening for any generic message event, any message that's sent, even if it's DM, will be caught and displayed on the browser. Um, and in the next few steps that I'll like record and post online, I'll show like how exactly to fix this, but I encourage everyone to think about it themselves. And I would also like think about whether that change should be made on the client side or on the server side. But yeah, so is everyone able to like at least see like the chat messages changing when we change tabs and having them persist over time? I guess if you're able to copy the query. If not, also feel free to like check out step 9. That should also uh, work with the same behavior. Okay, cool. Any like last minute questions about anything? Database query, sockets, how we may potentially fix this issue? Okay, cool. So I guess that's it for now. If you have any questions, as always, like just feel free to either ask on the questions doc or come up to us. I'll post a video recording of the last few steps that show how to fix this issue by actually emitting events to individual sockets rather than everything. Um, and yeah, thanks for listening. All right, so welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to finish walking through the steps of workshop 9 that we didn't actually get to finish in class today. And these steps kind of involve emitting socket events to individual sockets rather than everyone at once, and then just doing some filtering to clean up the chat at the end. So we left off in class by kind of looking at this one interesting issue, which is that if I'm logged in to, okay, so I also need to start my site. But if I'm logged into the, multiple different accounts that are DMing, users who aren't part of that DM chain will still be able to see messages in all chat. And I'll demo that right now. And just to make sure everyone's on the same page, we can all git reset -- hard, and then git checkout w9 - step 9. And then again, that's npm run start to start the backend server, and then npm run hot loader to kind of run the local client server. So let's take a look at this issue. I have 3 Google accounts logged into the website right now. And from left to right, these are Seymour, MI, and Michael. And let's say that like Seymour is trying to send a DM to MI. And he will say something like, as we can see, MI is able to instantly see that DM as expected. However, a third party, in this case, Michael, is actually able to see that same message in all chat, which is like clearly not what we want, right? Because DM should be private and shouldn't be accessible by users who aren't intended recipients.
just kind of demo that again. If Michael responds, again, I'll see that DM in all chat, even though I'm not this account, Michael, should not be able to see those messages. And we discussed in class that the reason why this is happening is because our server in api.js on line 114 is emitting this message event to every single connected socket, regardless of whether this is a message meant for all chat or if it's meant as a DM. This means that when the user, the client, is listening for on this message channel, so listening for these message events, any messages, regardless of whether they are DMs or all chat, will be caught and then displayed on the browser. As kind of we alluded to before, the way we're going to fix this is by individually emitting socket events only for users who are part of a DM chain. So that's the sender and the recipient of a DM message. And to do that, we can navigate to app.js line 114 once again. And we're going to add some conditions here so that we make the right emissions at the right times. So if the message that the user is posting is meant for all chat, we can actually keep the same emission, simply emitting a socket event to all connected sockets because everyone's meant to receive this message. However, we will now also account for the case when the message is a DM. So if the recipient's not all chat, we can assume that this message is a DM, in which case we'll only want to emit socket events to both the sender and the recipient of the DM. In order to do that, we'll need to get the sockets that are associated with both of these users. And we can do that with a function called socket manager dot get socket from from user ID. And this is like essentially the name pretty accurately describes what this function does. This will simply get the socket associated with a particular user ID. So first we can notify the sender, and this would be rec.user ._ID. And once we have this socket that's returned by this function that's associated with rec.user, we'll want to emit an event to that socket. And we'll call it the same thing because we actually want the client to handle it in the same way, simply adding it to the list of active or messages of the active chat. We'll also need to emit a socket event to the recipient. We can do the same thing by getting the corresponding socket with get socket from user ID. However, this time we'll pass in the ID of the intended recipient. So that's rec.body because this is a post request, so the information is contained in rec.body. And it will be the recipient field of the body. So simply we'll emit socket events to the socket belonging to the sender, rec.user, as well as the socket belonging to the intended recipient, rec.body. Now, if we navigate back to our example, we'll see that this actually is able to resolve the issue we were seeing before, because when the message is a DM, only the participants of the DM are notified via the socket emissions. So once again, Seymour will be trying to message or DM MI. And we'll see if a third party, Michael, will be able to see the message in all chat. So Seymour to Michael or to MI will say, hello, this is now private. And as expected, MI will get this message. However, Michael, the third party, who's not part of this DM exchange, will not be able to see this message in any of these chats. Cool. So there's one slight thing that we need to account for as well, which is the possibility of sending a DM to yourself. So if you look at our website, we can see that we have the ability to DM ourselves. So for example, MI may send a message to MI saying, this is a self DM. And we can see something weird happens. We actually get two of these messages appearing. And the reason for that is because we're emitting this socket event to both the sender and the recipient. So if both of them are the same user, we'll actually emit two socket events, causing this duplicate message problem. And instead, what we'll want to do is like double check to see if the user is the same as the recipient. And if so, we won't actually want to emit this second message. So we can just check this kind of like this. So if the sender rec.user.id, and we're only going to want to send the second one if the sender is not equal to the recipient. So once again, we'll always notify the sender via the socket. And then if the sender is different from the recipient, we'll also notify the recipient via the socket. And just to kind of demo this working one more time, let's log in with one of our accounts and try to initiate a self-DM. This should not appear twice. And indeed, we only get this message once. So that's the end of step 9. We've successfully prevented third parties from watching private DMs. And we've also handled the case where we are DMing ourselves. So we shouldn't actually emit individual socket events twice. So now that we're here, we're almost completely finished with our Chatbook page. There's just one more subtle issue that we need to take care of. And to see what that is, let's again consider the case where Seymour, this leftmost account, is DMing MI. Let's say MI has the all chat window open. If now Seymour, this leftmost account, wants to send a message to MI, this is a DM to MI, you'll see that for some reason, MI actually has this message appear in all chat, which is kind of weird, right? Because I thought we just fixed that issue. Well, it's a slightly different issue because if you look at a third party, the third party, in this case, Michael, still does not see this DM. So it's not as severe. We're not like leaking DMs to other people. It's just that we're displaying the DMs in the wrong page. So essentially what we need to do is add a filter to say like, I'm only going to display a message on the client side if it belongs to the current chat I have open. So in order to do that, let's first all get on the same page by typing git reset -- hard and then git checkout w9 step 10. And as I mentioned before, we'll be doing this filtering on the client side to kind of just determine whether or not we should display a message and if it's the correct open chat to display the message on. And to do that, we're going to look at line 55. And simply put, we're just going to check a bunch of conditions to make sure that we should be displaying this message to the client based off of what windows they have open. And it's a pretty long function, so I'm just going to copy and paste it in here. And it's not super important to like copy this yourselves. Instead, I'll just like walk through kind of what the logic is and why we're filtering it out. And then if you want to run this locally, you can either copy it down or simply check out w9 - complete. But if we look at this, recall that this add messages function is the function that is called whenever the client hears a socket event called message. And what it's going to do is it's going to add the message that's sent along with the socket to the active chat. And this is essentially just doing some filtering before to make sure we only update the active chat if these conditions are met. And again, these conditions are from the bottom to the top. If this message that was just received was meant for all chat, and we're currently looking at all chat, we should update the active chat. Otherwise, we're in a DM, which means we should only display messages that correspond to that DM chain. So that's if the recipient is who we're currently talking to, and it was sent by us, or if it was sent by us, sorry, I think I mixed this up. The top one says, if the intended recipient of the message is who we're currently talking to, and it was sent by us, we should display it. Similarly, if it was sent by who we're currently talking to, so whoever we have active chat set to, and the recipient is us, we'll display it. So essentially, these two messages at the top say, if this is a correct DM message, display it. This bottom one says, if it's an all chat message and we're looking at all chat, we should display it. So if we navigate back to our example, and again, we'll just use the same example, Seymour, the leftmost account, will be trying to send a DM to MI, the middle account here. And we'll see that now the middle account MI will not see their DMs in all chat. However, when they navigate to the DM page, they'll be able to see it. Cool. So with that, we finished up building out our chatbook page, and it should be pretty functionally equivalent to the example we saw at the beginning at weblab.is/example. One thing to note is that currently you won't be able to communicate with other users on different computers because we're running our backend server locally. However, when we get to the deployment lecture and you actually deploy your servers, you'll be able to then chat with anyone who's connected to the same server as you, even if they're not using the same computer. So that's something to keep in mind as you're testing. But it'll make more sense after we talk about, deploying our backend to some remote server somewhere. And I just wanted to kind of end with some high level notes about what we learned in this workshop and how sockets work in general. Pretty much, we'll just need to remember a few things when working with sockets. And that's every time you want to use a socket, it's a two-step process. One of those steps is to instruct the client to listen for a certain socket event. And this is done with the socket.on syntax in the client. We can specify the name of the socket event we want to listen to, and we'll specify a callback function that's executed whenever the client hears the event that we're listening to. The second step would be to have the server actually emit events of different types to the clients to inform them that something has happened. There's two ways we can do this. One of them is with this .getIO, .emit syntax. And I just realized that this is actually the wrong case. .getIO, .emit syntax will essentially be like a shout because it emits an event to every single connected server or every single connected client to the server. And again, with that, we can pass some sort of data for the client to use whenever they hear that event. In contrast, we can do something called a whisper, which is essentially done with this get socket from user ID syntax. And we'll call .emit to emit a socket event only to the socket that belongs to this user ID. Again, we'll specify an event name for the socket event, and we'll also pass the user some data. It's worth noting that we can actually use clients or sockets to communicate client to server as well. And we'll kind of cover that in the next lecture tomorrow on games. But either way, this is a very high level overview of how we'll use sockets. And I encourage everyone to think about the last few steps and kind of the differences between getIO.emit and get socket from user ID.emit and kind of the different scenarios in which you'd use them. And as always, we're happy to take any questions on Piazza and office hours. And especially if you're building any sites that involve these concepts, we highly encourage you to come talk to us to clarify any confusions that may arise. All right, thanks for watching. So one more thing I forgot in step 10 that's pretty important is that in order to get this to work properly, we'll actually need to move the definition of this add messages callback function. And I'll just go ahead and do that at first and then kind of explain why this is important in a second. So let's all cut that message or the add messages callback function and move it into this use effect on line 73. And this is the same use effect that we turned on the socket in. Note that I've also added some dependencies of this use effect, specifically the ActiveChat.recipient.id and the props.userID. It's not super important to understand why we have to do this, But essentially, the reason is because whenever we define a callback function and pass it into a socket, all variables are frozen. So essentially, this means like this active chat.recipient ID will be frozen to the value of when it's passed into the socket function. And similarly, for like props.user ID. So in order for us to actually like use those values and change them as they update, we'll need to add the callback function into this use effect and have the use effect execute anytime any of those variables change. This way, when the callback function is passed into the sockets, the correct values will be used. I know might be kind of confusing, but an easy thing to remember is like whenever you're using callback functions for sockets, it's good to define them within the use effect that you turn the socket on, as well as add any variables that may change to the dependency list. And again, as always, like if this is confusing, we really encourage you to post Piazza questions about this or come to office hours for explanation. This can be a source of like many hard to find bugs when using sockets, so just be careful for those.